Welcome to the Real Estate Forum, a podcast from the Paul Milstein Center for Real Estate at Columbia Business School. I'm your host, Raphael Sidelsky. This is your place for key insights into the evolving real estate landscape, from candid conversations with real estate thought leaders, including the esteemed faculty of the MBA Real Estate program, to cutting-edge research from the Milstein Center's Research Lab. Let's dive in. My guest today is Hossein Fateh, a pioneer and leader in the global data center industry. He is the founder and CEO of CloudHQ and Cloud Capital. Established in 2016, CloudHQ is one of the largest privately held developers and operators of hyperscale data centers in the world, with a footprint of over 30 million square feet in 23 global campuses, including 2,000 megawatts of contracted IT load and 4,000 megawatts of expansion pipeline. Cloud Capital is an affiliated investment management firm focused on investing in high-quality data centers globally. Since 2020, the firm has acquired over $6 billion in assets and has offices in Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and London. Between CloudHQ and Cloud Capital, Hossein employs 350 professionals globally across 13 countries. Before founding CloudHQ and Cloud Capital, Hossein co-founded and led DuPont Fabros Technologies, or DFT, which he took public as an early data center REIT. Hossein holds a BA in Business Administration and an MS in Finance, both from George Washington University. Hossein, welcome to the Real Estate Forum.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let's start at the beginning. You began your career working through real estate bankruptcies. What did that teach you about risk, real estate, and capital alignment?
I grew up learning real estate. My boss was in bankruptcy, so I understand the US bankruptcy code very well. When the dot-com crash happened, I saw an opportunity whereby we were landlords to a company called Exodus Communication. And we signed a lease on a campus in Ashburn, Virginia, for 650,000 square feet for this company, Exodus Communication. Exodus was in the retail business of data centers. So essentially, they rented racks on a month-to-month basis on the retail data centers. And when they went bankrupt, I knew how to navigate through the bankruptcy. So first, we collected all the deposits. And then in US bankruptcy, the claim against the estate is typically around approximately 15% of rents, but no more than 3 years, no less than 1 year. So I gave up our claim against the bankrupt estate of Exodus, and then I essentially foreclosed on all the infrastructure. By the infrastructure meant that I owned the shell. The shell was a $10 million of shell in sometime in 2001. They had put in generators, C boards, D boards, switchgear, PDUs, and air conditioning systems in my 100,000 square foot building. And they had invested $55 million. But if they pulled that $55 million out, it would be worth the scrap of what the generators are worth. So when they rejected that lease in the bankruptcy, because Exodus and many others in the dot-com boom had overbuilt, I got control of that infrastructure. And then we, as a real estate guy, we developed the first triple net leases in data centers, and we developed the wholesale business. And I ended up leasing the entire building to Equinix for essentially 3 to 4 times the value of the rent of just the shell because of the infrastructure on a triple net basis. And then I thought, oh my God, this is such a good idea. Let's do this again. And we went around the country buying distressed assets in 2001, 2, and 3. I bought 7 buildings from Cable and Wireless. I bought an AboveNet building, again, from the bankruptcy of AboveNet in Reston. And then I went to Los Angeles and bought another building from a landlord of Exodus. And again, essentially did a deal with the bankrupt estate of Exodus and got control of that asset as well. And then we also I also bought an empty building from America Online and again leased that to Microsoft. And then eventually the distress ran out.
You then went on to co-found DuPont Fabros Technology, taking it public and scaling it before it was acquired by Digital Realty for $7.8 billion. What were the key lessons from that chapter?
When the distress ran out, I had a couple of empty shells in Ashburn, Virginia. And those shells were rented to Yahoo. I rented them to Yahoo and Microsoft. And essentially, this was in the early 2004, 5, where they said, okay, can you build us more data center space? And I said, well, if you sign the lease, I will. And they signed the lease, and then we started building. There was no more distress left. Assets for Microsoft and Yahoo. And then the third building was an asset called ACC4, where predominantly in 2006, Facebook was the largest tenant. I mean, at the time when Facebook first approached us, I was thinking, why does a college dating site need 2,000 servers? I mean, how much are people dating? How's that even possible? And so, but we thought all of it as real estate. The model was all triple net. We even still have some of the same clauses in the leases, which were the CapEx recapture clauses. And we financed these assets very long term. So the tenants got much lower rent than they would have renting from co-location, which is when they rent rack by rack. For us at the time, we were getting anywhere between 12 to 15% unleveraged return. And the leases that we had, the lending that we had was self-amortizing. So we weren't able to take out cash because the lenders at the time wanted to self-amortize all the loans. Many of those banks, not because of us, don't exist anymore. And then in early 2007, we needed access to public debt. And we realized very quickly that the banks at the time each had a lending limit of, say, 100 million. So to put a $400 million deal together, I'm talking about this building, ACC4, where Facebook was the biggest tenant. It was extremely difficult to do a deal with 4 lenders, where we have 3 lenders on the first trust. None of them had the lead. And then Lehman Brothers was the mezz, and we had a $40 million equity piece. This was with Lamont DuPont as my co-founder. We realized this model is not repeatable and that it's too difficult to piece these things together. So we hired Lehman Brothers and UBS as investment banks to take the company public. We called it DuPont Fabros Technology. At the time, I didn't know where it was better, or I would get a better valuation as a REIT or as a tech company. When we looked at the multiples, REITs were trading, Digital Realty was already public, but they were trading around the 17 multiple and on SSO, whereby the tech companies were trading more like a 15 multiple. So like, oh, well, okay, well, let's be a REIT. And then where Digital Realty owned at the time mostly shells, they didn't own the guts of the data center. And by the guts, I don't mean the servers, I mean the data center infrastructure that brings all the electrical equipment to the PDU, which is the electric plug, and the cooling. And so the underwriters told us, you need a private letter ruling. So in March of 2007, I applied for the first private letter ruling qualifying data centers as good REIT income. There was some precedent in cold storage and others that had achieved a private letter ruling. We got the ruling in October of 2007, and we took the company public for a valuation of 1.65 billion in October of 2007. And that gave us access to public debt. Soon afterwards, the world fell apart, and in 2008. And so we worked through, the stock tanked because of short-term maturities. But I never raised any dilutive equity. And we managed to refinance all the assets. And eventually, when the stock went above the IPO, we started to raise more equity. And that's the power of the REIT, in that it's very doable for REITs to raise equity as well as debt to grow. And then I ran that public company for 8 years, but eventually realized that a REIT is not so suitable for development, is much better suited for owning yield co type assets and distributing the dividend. For a REIT to own land for many years and get power, the investors are not so patient on that. And then I also our clients were telling us to go to Europe, and there's a lot of tax leakage for REITs when you go to Europe. So I resigned from the company, I resigned from the board, and DuPont Fabros my board sold it to Digital Realty for 7.8 billion. And then I did not have a non-compete, and I formed CloudHQ, and frankly, all my executives came with me. So this is certainly not a one-man show. All my lieutenants from DuPont Fabros joined me, and there out of like 10 of them, 9 are still with me and 1 retired. And that's the new team. And this new team, at the time when DuPont Fabros was sold, we had 340 megawatts of IT load. That's the measurement metrics that we all think about. Now, CloudHQ, we've leased over 2,000 megawatts of IT load, and we have over 4 gigawatts, which is 4,000 megawatts, maybe even close to 5,000 of powered land in 13 countries worldwide.
Tell us what you can do privately with your two affiliated businesses and how CloudHQ and Cloud Capital is set up today. What does the business look like today? And what are the, extra things you can do in this new format?
As a private company, I'm about 50% of the equity, and the other 50% is friends and family. Buying powered land or getting land and getting the approvals where half the money is. Half the money, as in any form of real estate, is in the entitlements and approvals of land, whereby sometimes you get the power before you get the land. The power and the land are most important, and then the fiber. So in many locations, like in London, I bought land at somewhere around £800,000 an acre. That land today, with the power, is valued around £4 to £5 million an acre. And so you also need to get fiber optics to it. And so getting it, you need to get entitlements, which takes many years. You need to get power to it. We were the first site in the UK to be connected to the national grid. The national grid in the UK is powered at a high voltage of about 400 kVA. At 400 kVA, that power has only been down twice since 1987. Is an extremely stable grid. And from the national grid substation to our substation is 1,000 feet underground. So that when we first approached the national grid, they said, well, you can't connect to us. You need to go through the local grid. And we were refused 4 or 5 times. And we kept going back and saying, what did the steel industry do 40 years ago? Why did the car manufacturing industry do 30 years ago when there was a Vauxhall cars made in England? And they came back and said, well, they were connected to national grid. And we're like, well, we're the new industry. Why can't we be connected to national grid? First, it's a more stable grid. We'll pay for our own substation. Second, we get power 7% cheaper. And so in many locations, we've done that. It's to get the power, get the land. I went and registered with Ofcom and became a registered English telecom. And we dug 110-kilometer underground cable lines going from Slough to Didcot and back as a fiber optic loop, crossing the River Thames 4 times. And British Rail once. British Rail was actually crossing that was more difficult than crossing the River Thames. On the Thames, we went under the bridges. Crossing British Rail took 6 months. So that gave us a latency advantage on our connection that otherwise we would not have. So getting all these things together you really need to be a full-on real estate developer to get that ready and all the approvals, whereby as a REIT, you really want to collect dividends and pay those dividends out. That structure is very difficult to do as a public company. And similarly, we did that in Brazil. Similarly, we did that in Virginia. When there was a time when we could just put up our hand and said we want the power, and the power company was bring us the power. Now you need to put hundreds of millions of dollars as deposits to get the power. But back then, we managed to get substations to our site and dig fiber optic lines to where we need to connect and then get the approvals. That structure is difficult to do as a public company. Like in Brazil, I built high tension wires to the Brazilian national grid going through 14 kilometers, the big, massive steel high tension wires to the Brazilian national grid and back. That, as you can imagine, is difficult to do in a public format.
Absolutely. So that makes a lot of sense. And you've consistently anticipated and responded to infrastructure demand shifts from internet to cloud, and now AI and neo cloud. What are the key demand shifts you're currently following and see ahead?
What has happened, and you hit on it with your question, is that as the internet developed, we kept up with the demand of the internet. In 2004, it was the search wars between Yahoo and Microsoft and Google. In 2006, 2007, social media, developed. And again, that meant higher demand for data center capacity. In 2009, we started getting fiber to the house. When you start getting fiber to the house, you start developing all these video games, and then Netflix stopped selling CDs and started streaming videos. I mean, for a while, and maybe even today, Netflix is the biggest demand of fiber optics in the whole country of Canada. And so more and more, as internet speeds increased, more and more demand developed. And if you can imagine, in 2013, the offices started taking your Exchange server from the back of the kitchen in the office to Microsoft 365. That was the advent and the start of the public cloud. And so more and more things shifted to the public cloud, and the cloud has become AWS, Microsoft, Google, Oracle Cloud, more almost like a utility, and has grown so big. And that's what's given these companies their $1 trillion of valuation, in that everything that is now started goes into the public cloud. Then in 2014, 15, we started getting 4G, 5G, and high-speed internet on our phones. And when you start getting this high speed, then you start having things like Uber wouldn't have existed, geolocation, you can find the Starbucks anywhere on your phone, you can have all the shared apps, and all that stuff started going in the public cloud, and more of that started going in the public cloud. And the public cloud became bigger and bigger and more dominant. In 2000, then with the advent of the last and the biggest, like for example, many of the people in finance know that 70% of the world's money management is done by a platform called Aladdin. Aladdin is owned by BlackRock. BlackRock hosts it on Microsoft Azure. And so that platform literally is very difficult to move. And so in the public cloud, Microsoft or Amazon has thousands of customers within a building. Within that building, if the application is the public cloud, that becomes very difficult to move. If the application is, say, Google search, Google can unilaterally want to move it, and they can move it because it's everywhere. But the public cloud, because of its structure of thousands of customers, really cannot move. And the latest now, which took us all by surprise, is AI. In January of 2005, we started getting massive demand on AI. And AI has two functions. One is training. The second is inference. The training can be anywhere in the world. However, the US big tech companies have so far kept the majority of the training in the US, probably for security reasons. However, the inference needs to be close to population centers where the public cloud is. And that inference needs to be close in. And the majority of the inference is going in the public cloud locations, which are typically in and around airport type of areas of population centers. And that really exploded the demand profile, whereby in Ashburn, Virginia, land prices in early 2000s were $6 or $7 a foot, and now could be as much as $150 a foot.
That's helpful as context to where we are today. And you touched on the importance of power and all the creative things you've done. But beyond power, there are a lot of community concerns. Noise, water use, and land are front and center. You've been tackling that in a bunch of different ways. You have a data center in Paris where waste heat can be used to warm homes. You have a project in Mexico which will be developed without the need for evaporative cooling. And you've been engaging directly with regulators in the UK, France, and elsewhere. So are these your strategic advantages, or have they become the new table stakes for the data center development business?
I think the latter, in that, look, there's a lot of bad press around data centers. First of all, they're labeling big tech companies as the evil, and that's not the case. This data is my daughter's Instagram, or your children's Instagram, or your money management that it runs on Aladdin, or your emails. This is the country, this is the public's data. This is not big tech data. This is you and I's data and our children's data. I mean, try taking every parent, when they want to punish a child, they're like, give me your phone for 2 days. That's the biggest, this is not, and so this data needs to be housed somewhere, right? And so big tech companies are given a bad rap for that, which is easy to do. And a lot of the rap is, unjustifiable, I feel, in that in Loudoun County, Virginia, 2.5% of the land value is producing 35 to 38% of the taxes. I mean, who wouldn't want that, right? And data centers don't create traffic. They don't create schools. They pay a lot and they bring a lot of construction jobs. And who is going to say that construction worker, journeyman electrician that makes $70 an hour is not a real job? Like, we have not stopped building data centers in Ashburn for 25 years. And so I think somewhat is unjustifiable. And then the water usage is also unfairly labeled, in that a lot of the water we use in Loudoun County is gray water. Gray water essentially is reprocessing of sewage water, where we're actually helping. Why wouldn't you want to use that water? We actually pay for it. It's environmentally good to reuse that water, and that water evaporates. And so if you can think of water as a utility, a data center that can evaporate some water can go from a PUE of, say, 1.28 to 1.18. So if you can use a little bit of water, you're much more efficient in cooling it. So every dollar of electricity, you spend 18 cents cooling it. And so that is super efficient if you can do it with, if there's water available. If there's no water available in those locations, it'll be more expensive. It'll be a closed loop water system that doesn't evaporate. Now, we are going, like you said, in places like France and Germany and giving our heat away for, we've agreed to do it for district heating. But the efficiency of it is questionable in that our heat is around 28 degrees centigrade. And the heat that you need for district heating is about 70 degrees. So you do need to reheat that. In France, we're talking to the local municipality to using our heat for greenhouses. For that, we think is a really good use. But, you can use it for the winter to heat greenhouses. For that, we think it's a great reuse. But is it the efficiencies? Most of the efficiencies are already there, in that we try to be as efficient as possible with water and electricity, but there are real limits of what we can get.
You've talked about cost per available megawatt as a key metric in the business. Can you walk us through how you think about the economics and your underwriting in sort of real estate parlance, yield on cost, returns? How does the business sort of underwrite for you?
Well, yes. Look, years ago, about 20 years ago, we realized that the cost per square foot doesn't really matter. And that what really the metric that matters is the tenant's cost per kilowatt per month of available power. So we look at that as the key metric, in that our construction cost, we think about per megawatt of IT load. Our tenant cost, we think about per kilowatt of IT load that you can plug in. The tenants don't really care about how many square feet necessarily we give them. They want to know how many servers they can plug in as long as we can cool it. So the buildings are engineered in that the shell of the building may cost 150 to 200 bucks a foot. But the rest of the building, which is $1,000 a foot, is in the infrastructure that it takes to bring. The more power you can give the tenant, the more infrastructure you have to build. And 1 kilowatt of energy translates to 1 kilowatt of heat, and you got to pull that heat out. So as the buildings and servers are becoming more and more dense, as the servers become more and more power hungry, we need to give them more power, and then we got to take out that heat. So that's why the business really revolves around how much electricity, redundant electricity, we can give to the tenants. And so we even think about operating costs in real estate terms, which is triple net terms, which in you and I's old world was taxes, insurance, and common area maintenance. We think of that as how much kilowatt a month is that going to cost, and what does the tenant expect to pay per building. On smaller buildings, that tends to be 40 to 50 bucks a month per kilowatt a month of operating expenses. On bigger buildings, we realized it could be under $20 a month. And at the same time, the rent could be anywhere between $100 to $140 a month in rent. And to answer that question, that rent for development yields tend to be, for good credit tenants, in and around 7.5% to 9% development yields, yield on cost.
Mm-hmm.
And for less creditworthy tenants, it may be that, and by creditworthy, my definition is investment grade by S&P, may be higher than in the 11% or 12%, depending on the credit of the tenant, unlevered yields. And then the value creation is somewhere between 5.5 to 6.5 cap rate. That's kind of the exit valuation cap rate.
So there's a great spread between your exit cap and your development yield on cost.
Which is, for real estate, is as good as you get, right?
Absolutely. All the new entrants into the data center space compressed those spreads?
Oh yeah, for sure. Now what has happened in the last year because of the AI demand is that the haves and have-nots. We not necessarily have expanded or contracted spreads. It's a matter of, do you have the powered land or do you not have it? And frankly, the world I live in is the world of 3 or 4 customers. And so in the world of the downside of the business is you only have 3 or 4 customers. In the world of, it's Microsoft, Amazon, Oracle. I mean, that's like the extent of the world that we live in. And so my philosophy is you always want to work and have a good relationship with those tenants. So in a real estate world, when demand is high, you try and increase your yields. Here, you want to keep the relationship with the tenants, at least in my view, and you try and keep the yields you have and don't really expand those yields because you want that customer to be happy with you next time.
Last year, you completed a $1.3 billion asset-backed securitization. Tell us about the deal and its future applicability to your capital structures.
Well, look, what has happened now is the demand for the data centers and what is coming down the pipeline is massive. And that the banks alone are not enough to finance construction and to finance the takeout. And so we're in the world, whether with ABS and we need to get these assets rated. These days, we just got construction loans also rated investment grade. We just got one rated BBB+, and we are getting by credible rating agencies, and we're getting the permanent loans ABS rated as well. That deal you're talking about, we got a straight A rating by S&P. And then when you get these things rated, the insurance companies can also buy pieces of that debt. And so that's very much the world that we're going in, where more and more of these assets need to be rated and just to be able to have the volume. The volume that's coming down the pipeline is way bigger than any of us have seen on the debt that we need for construction and the debt that we need for exit. like CMBS, ABS, private placements, all of these are pieces of debt that we need to access. And we're working with multiple investment banks to be able to access. And I'm not alone. It's me, all my competitors and I are in the same boat, because we don't even know where all of this debt can be placed long term. And most of it is high investment grade as well, but just a lot of it is coming down the pipeline.
You're developing in Mexico, Brazil, France, Japan, UK, and the US. How do you decide where to go next? And how do you underwrite execution risk in developing markets versus more established markets?
Well, I think I'm going to answer your question in reverse. We look at country risk and we take a premium on the 10-year bonds of that particular country. So that's how we look at country risk. Like, obviously, Japan, Germany, the 10-year bonds of those countries are low. And so we're at the low end of development risk. So we need a few hundred basis points of premium over that country risk. And that's how we look at country risk and where we need to be. To answer the first part of your question is we try and get, for lack of a better word, warm and fuzzy from our tenants and to understand where the demand is going to be. And that demand is sometimes it takes a long time. And sometimes the best answer is to be able to wait 8 years and to buy the land, to get the power, get the permits. Like in Germany, it takes 2 years just to get the permits. In most countries, you have to get permits for the shell of the building. In Germany, we need to permit the entire guts of the building. And so that takes a long time. And so it's real hardcore real estate development risk.
How do you think about exit liquidity and long-term ownership of these gigantic data centers, which are going to be worth billions and in fact tens of billions of dollars? Is that REITs? Is that infra funds? Is that strategics?
I think it's all of the above. Look, as a real estate business, I really like it in that I've owned office buildings in the past. An office building, you have money leaving the building every 5 to 10 years. You need to pay real estate commissions. You need to pay tenant improvements. And when you pay tenant improvements, those could be $100 a foot. When the building itself is $400 to $500 a foot. So when you have that money, 25% money every 5 or 10 years leaves the building because that new law firm does not want the same build out as the old law firm. And it runs out. So money leaves that building. That is a negative to real estate. And even in apartments to a lesser case, you still need to recarpet and paint, but the much lesser case. That's why apartment buildings trade at a lower cap rate than office buildings, right? It's also a nice inflation hedge. And so in data centers, money does not leave the building. The buildings are maintained to the highest degree, and the OPEX of the tenants pays for that maintenance. I've only had 2 tenants in my 25 years of experience leave a building. One was interesting, was Bridgewater. Bridgewater leased at DuPont Fabros for 10 years. Bridgewater, the hedge fund. They never occupied. And at the end of the lease, they gave up their lease. And I think they leased 2 megawatts of space, IT load. They never occupied. So they didn't need it. They leased it. Maybe there was their backup. They're so secretive. Who knows? The second tenant was Yahoo when their business essentially went away. I think Yahoo outsourced their search functions to either Microsoft or Google, I don't remember which one, in the mid 2000s. And they said that we want to release the space. The tenant improvements, which typically cost between back then $1 to $2 million of $1 to $2 million per megawatt of IT load. That tenant improvement is the wiring that is plugged to the wall at the PDU, and it goes on the overhead busway, and then these cables dangle down that attach to the servers. That work is $1 or $2 million a megawatt of IT load. When Yahoo left, within 90 days, Microsoft released the space. They used the same TIs. So that TI was reused. And that TI we never paid for. Yahoo paid for. So Microsoft got the benefit of that TIs. So it's like saying the new law firm came, loved so much the build out of the new law firm, they never did any build out because there is no TIs that needs to be redone. So in that sense, I think the long-term ownership is extremely stable. The tenants don't leave, money doesn't leave the buildings, and the buildings are well maintained. So I think those, you could think about long-term, those cap rates being compressed.
That's very interesting because there's this common conception or misconception that there's obsolescent risk with the business, and that as technology advances, tenants want different sort of systems inside the building, and there is risk around that. So how do you frame that?
The product that we are renting is available, redundant power at the wall. Servers will forever need power. And what we've seen is that servers need more and more power as time goes along. Power that goes into the wall also needs to be cooled. And the servers, there's something called Moore's Law. In Moore's Law, Gordon Moore, one of the founders of Intel, said every processing power doubles every 2 years. Or he said every 18 months. It's actually slowed to about every 2 years. However, those servers need more and more power. So and as they need more power, they need more cooling. And so we are not renting available space, we're renting per kilowatt. So a 10 megawatt data center at 10 kilowatts a rack can handle 1,000 racks. At the moment, the AI racks have gone to 30, 40 kilowatts. There's talk of them going to 180. There's even talk of a megawatt rack. But so as the racks become more and more power hungry, we will simply put in less racks in the same room. But the tenants are not paying for the space anyway. They're paying for the available power, and the available power cannot be increased because all the backup equipment that needs to go into the redundancy, and then you also need to cool it. So there is a scenario where a data center could have 1,000 racks. Now that 1,000 racks would be 100 racks. And then, but only less than half of the data center is the compute space. So but the rest of the data center is the backup equipment. So the compute space may be some spare space left in it. But that in that's but that doesn't really matter because the tenants don't really care about, they're not paying for that empty space. They're only paying for the available power. And the empty space is worth the shell, which is $150 a square foot. So $150 a square foot, if you've got a 100,000 square feet of empty space, no one really cares about that. But as the racks also become higher density, beyond 20, 30 kilowatts a rack, we need to cool them with water. So the cooling that needs to be done with water goes through a heat exchanger and a CDU. And so we tap the water of the building, go to a heat exchanger and a pump. The empty space is going to be used for that element, and that water goes to the rack and then back again. NVIDIA dictates that racks, that the CDU needs to be, anything that touches that water needs to be stainless steel. So some of that empty space will be used for that CDU anyway. The other part of it is different applications need different densities. Like I had a data center, 1780 Business Center Drive in Reston, Virginia, that was a 13 megawatt data center that it was sold when DuPont Fabros was sold. This is a 2004 vintage data center that I bought from the bankruptcy of the BovNet. It's an amazing location. It's only 13 megawatts. It sits in Reston, Virginia, which is, they have 50 different carriers are on the road in front of us. That data center is perfect reuse for an edge building. The edge buildings are more network hungry, and those buildings have less density. So that data center is perfect. I wanted to buy it back from Digital a few years ago, and the deal didn't happen. My bad, but that's a perfect data center for edge. The edge is something like content delivery, what Akamai does. Those densities are not AI densities. So we just reuse the building for a different application that has lower densities. So I haven't really well-designed data centers of 20 years ago. All of them are still in use. So I haven't really seen that obsolescence really take place that people are talking about. Now, if the building is really badly designed, I can see that. But so is an office building that's really badly designed, has the same problem.
Elon Musk recently said he's going to have data centers in space in 30 months. What are your thoughts on the viability of those plans? And could we see training off planet and inference remaining earthbound?
Good luck to him. I don't see it. And look, on you never want to bet against him because genius of what he's done, but the scale of the things that we're building, I don't see the buildings that we're building are 1 million to 1.5 million square feet. And with those type of scale buildings need hundreds of, like that scale needs, we may have 100, 150 people working, maintaining that building. How do you get 150 people to be in space maintaining the buildings? The servers need to be changed out. The racks need maintenance. All the electrical equipment needs maintenance. All of that backup power needs maintenance. How do you put that scale into space? I think that, look, and then there are latency issues. Latency of how applications that need to be on the public cloud, there are applications that need 30 milliseconds of latency. You can't get 30 milliseconds of latency from a satellite back down. And so I think there are certain applications that could be in space, but land in and around airports are cheap enough and easy to maintain, whereby you would not need rocket fuel and people living up in space maintaining them. So on a small scale, I see certain applications go there that are, within a few megawatts of IT load that could be in space, but I don't see, AI. I don't see thousands of megawatts of AI training going into space. At the moment, AI training is going into remote places in Texas where land is particularly cheap and there's a lot of spare natural gas being burnt coming out of the ground. I mean, that would be a better use instead of burning the natural gas that's flaming the natural gas coming out of the ground. Why would you go into rocket fuel and go into space to do that? So I don't see it on a large scale, but that happening. I think we may be occupying Mars before we see that on a large scale.
Would you consider taking CloudHQ and Cloud Capital public someday?
I think we would see pieces of that going public, yes, as a yield co. Like I see like stabilized assets going public as a yield co. That makes a lot of sense in that if you look at pure real estate, right, on a 20-year lease, if you enter at a 6.25 cap rate, you exit at a 6.25 cap rate, and there is 2.5% escalators over 20 years. You can generate easily a 10% IRR with high investment grade credit. That is as good as a investment grade bond, and that would it would yield you mathematically a 10% IRR. Even if the lease, I did the math the other day, even if the lease assumes does not renew after 20 years, the math says, and the land value is zero, and land values in Ashburn are not zero, but are $6 million an acre now. God knows what they'll be in 20 years. Even if you assume that is zero, you still generate mathematically a 7% IRR, where a Microsoft bond trades at sub 5. So the yield co makes a lot of sense for a passive investor. Someone like my mom can have her passive money and generate almost a investment grade bond type of return, but get 10% IRR. I think that's a great deal. So that type of assets, I believe, will be going public as a yield co. I don't necessarily want to be that CEO of that company because I've done it before, but there are some members of my team that I would put in charge and would want to be CEO of that asset class. And that asset class, I see that growing very rapidly because the risk-adjusted return is so good.
Digital Realty and Equinix have in fact underperformed the S&P and the NASDAQ over the last 3 to 5 years. Why do you think that is, despite this big AI boom and demand for data centers?
Look, it's a different risk profile. The S&P is 40% of it is 5 companies, right? It's 5 companies. It's a different risk profile. You're comparing Microsoft, you're comparing Oracle, you're comparing Apple, you're comparing the driving force of the S&P is the 5 tech giants, Amazon, And so you can't mix that return with a stable bond type of return that I was talking about 2 minutes ago. It's a different risk profile. And so you're comparing a stable risk adjusted return are very different to the risk adjusted return of what these massive tech companies have achieved.
You've highlighted conviction, creativity, and recognizing and seizing on your luck as three of your most valuable skill sets. Where have those themes shown up most in your journey?
Well, luck has certainly helped in my journey, being the right place and right time. I've been lucky enough where I've had good partners to be able to grab luck when it passes by. But I've been putting my head down, working hard, and I was lucky enough to be in the right industry and working with the people that I like working with.
What advice would you give to new investors entering the data center space now? Where are the best risk-adjusted return opportunities?
Well, if you can buy powered land in the right location, or able to get powered land in the right location, that's the easiest way to get in the business. There's a guy in Virginia who's been doing that very successfully, and he's been flipping the land to Amazon and Microsoft and getting the land, getting it powered, making sure, getting the fiber, and not even building anything that I've been building. I mean, that's where the new entrants could make a lot of money without a lot of initial capital. But that's becoming more and more difficult.
Before we wrap up, I'd like to ask for a personal recommendation, something outside of real estate, whether it's a book, a work of art, a habit, a trip, a mode of exercise, philosophy, or a life hack or lesson.
I've been having a lot of, as I'm getting older, I really enjoyed walking to work and walking back. And I wear these headphones that I really like, that I can listen to a podcast or most of the time, or be on the phone, and have been multitasking by doing, I spend an hour walking to work and an hour walking back and listening to a podcast or being on the phone and multitasking in my life. So I really enjoyed that. And so I do recommend that. And you can actually hear the traffic going by. So, and I've been doing my books, audio books. I did the Elon Musk book. It was terrific. I did all the podcasts, all the acquired series that I enjoy so much. And then even I like a lot of mountain climbing, snowshoeing, skinning up the mountains. When I do that kind of stuff, I just put a podcast or an audio book and kind of feel like I'm doing two things at the same time, multitasking.
Well, that's great. Good way to get your steps in for the day.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I've been really enjoying that.
Well, Hossein, thank you so much for joining us on the Real Estate Forum. We look forward to watching how you continue to use conviction, creativity, and occasionally seizing on your luck to build out the world's digital infrastructure.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure being on the podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Real Estate Forum, a podcast brought to you by the Paul Milstein Center for Real Estate at Columbia Business School. Be sure to subscribe for more insights from real estate thought leaders, industry professionals, faculty, and the latest research and expertise from the Milstein Center's Research Lab at Columbia Business School. If you've enjoyed the episode, please follow, rate, and share the podcast. You can keep up to date with the Paul Milstein Center for Real Estate at business.columbia.edu/real estate. Thanks again for joining us, and we will see you next time.